Alright folks, so today we're going to review for your upcoming geometry quiz. And what are we going to cover on your quiz? So we're going to look at the Pythagorean theorem and midsegments on a triangle. So we're going to explore how to find a missing side of a right triangle using the Pythagorean theorem. And we're going to see what happens to a triangle when we draw a midsegment, as you can see on the diagram by the red segment. So let's take a look at our first problem. So for the Pythagorean theorem, we want to find the missing side C. And remember, the Pythagorean theorem only works for right triangles. If you're not told that it's a right triangle, then you cannot use the Pythagorean theorem. So just keep in mind, C is reserved for the hypotenuse, or the longest side of a right triangle. And when we're trying to find the missing side, we use our formula a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And we have to ask ourselves, are we finding the leg or the hypotenuse? Well, here we know we're finding the hypotenuse, which is highlighted. So we just substitute 8 and 12 in for a and b. Those represent the legs of a right triangle. And this becomes a simple algebra problem, or even an arithmetic problem. So 12 squared is 144, 8 squared is 64. We add those two together, and we take the square root to get 14.4 units. So my diagram doesn't have units, and if you don't have units, just use U in place of units. So if you don't have feet or centimeters or whatnot, just use the letter U. So let's take a look at another example. So again, we're going to use the same equation, and we're trying to find the missing side A. And we have to ask ourselves, is that the leg or is that the hypotenuse? So in this case, that's going to be one of the legs. So I substitute 12 in for C, and 8 can go in for A or B. It realistically doesn't matter which one you substitute into. I substituted 8 in for B. So a squared plus 64 equals 144, and then I want to subtract 64. And then to get rid of the square next to the A, I'm going to take the square root on both sides to get the square root of 144 minus 64 to give me 8.9 units. So again, I just rounded to the nearest tenth. The actual answer is, it's going to go on forever in terms of decimal numbers. So I just rounded to the nearest tenth. So now let's take a look at midsegments. So what does a midsegment do to a triangle? So if you remember what a midsegment does, a midsegment connects the midpoints of two sides of a triangle. So if we take a look at our triangle here, and this orange segment is our midsegment. It connects both midpoints on both sides of that triangle. Alright, so since the midsegment connects midpoints, each side will have two congruent segments. So those two sides are going to be congruent, and then those two sides are going to be congruent to each other. So additionally, the midsegment is going to be parallel to the untouched side of the triangle. So the midsegment can only touch two sides of a triangle. The third side that it does not touch is going to be parallel to that untouched side, as indicated by the two green mini arrows. So because the lines are parallel, we know that corresponding angles are congruent. So we have those two corresponding angles that are going to be congruent, and then we have those two corresponding angles that are going to be congruent. And the midsegment is half the measure of the untouched side. So if you take a look at the diagram, I have two orange segments, and the shorter segment, which is the midsegment, is going to be half the measure of the larger segment. And additionally, what the midsegment does is it's going to create two similar triangles. So similar triangles are basically two triangles that have the exact same shape, but just different sizes. So let's try two problems with our midsegments. Alright, so let's try an easy one. Alright, so let's say I wanted to find our missing variables if AB is our midsegment. Alright, so we could find X just by doubling 10 to get 20, because our midsegment, remember, it's going to be half the length of our untouched side. So the third side of our triangle that's not touched by the midsegment is going to be twice the measure of AB. So you could either think of it like this. AB, the midsegment is going to be half the length of the untouched side, or the untouched side is going to be twice the length of the midsegment AB. So here 10 times 2 is going to give us 20. And then if we want to find y, keep in mind that the midsegment will bisect the sides that it touches. So we know that y is going to equal to the segment length above it, which in this case is going to be 7. And using the same logic, we could find z, which in this case is going to equal 8. So let's try another example. All right, so we're going to assume that AB is a midsegment, and we're going to find the missing variables. So we take a look at our diagram. We have two missing variables. We have x and then we have z. So we can see that 3x degrees and x plus 40 degrees are corresponding angles because, again, AB is a midsegment. And since corresponding angles are congruent because the lines are parallel, we could set their measures equal to each other. So we have 3x equals x plus 40. And then this becomes simple algebra. So we subtract x on both sides to get 2x equals 40. And then divide by 2 will give us x equals 20. So now that we found x, we can use that to find z. So again, we know AB is the midsegment. So what that means is that z minus 5, the untouched side, is going to be twice that of the midsegment length of 4x plus 5. So notice how I set up my equation. Remember, setting up your equation is far more important than solving the equation. You need to set up your equation properly because it's going to put you in good standing in the long run. So here we have z minus 5 equals 2 times 4x plus 5, and I distribute the 2 to get z minus 5 equals 8x plus 10. And I know what my value of x is. I found it earlier. It's 20. So I substitute 20 in for x. So I have z minus 5 equals 8 times 20 plus 10, which gives me z minus 5 equals 170. And if I add 5 to both sides to get z by itself, I get 175 equal to z. Okay, so what did we learn today? So we talked about the Pythagorean theorem, we talked about midsegments of triangles. So whenever you're using the Pythagorean theorem, you're using a squared plus b squared equals c squared to find the missing side of right triangles. Notice I underlined right. You cannot find the missing side using the Pythagorean theorem of a triangle if the triangle is not a right triangle. So you just need to make sure if you're finding the hypotenuse or the leg, because that's going to slightly alter how you're going to solve the problem. So keep that in mind. Don't just mindlessly use the Pythagorean theorem. That's one of the most common mistakes that I had from some of my students last year. All right, so here we have our right triangle. And we also talked about the properties of a midsegment in regards to triangles. And in midsegments, these properties can be applied to any triangle. So the midsegment will bisect the touching sides, giving two congruent segments on each side. So here we have our red colored midsegment. So we have those two sides that are going to be congruent to each other, or those two segments that are going to be congruent to each other. And then we have those two segments that are going to be congruent to each other. Right, and then we looked at another property of midsegments, and that's the fact that the midsegment is going to be parallel to the untouched side. So we take a look at our diagram. So the untouched side here is going to be C, right? And the midsegment is going to be half the length of C. So the red midsegment is going to be half of the length of side C. And you could tell by the mini green arrows that the midsegment is going to be parallel to side C, which is the untouched side. And then the last property that we looked at is since the midsegment is parallel to the untouched side, it's going to produce congruent corresponding angles. So we have those two angles that will be congruent to each other, and then we have these two angles that will be congruent to each other. So hopefully that was clear, and if not, you could always contact your teacher for additional help. So good luck, everybody.